Observing the prisoners and patients who cycled through my practice for 30 years, I witnessed something that challenged every progressive assumption about human nature and social policy. The paradox was inescapable. Those granted the most freedom from traditional constraints often became the most enslaved to their own impulses, dependencies, and destructive patterns. The welfare recipients who never had to work became slaves to lethargy and despair. The criminals freed from moral judgment became prisoners of their own violence. The children liberated from discipline became captives of their immediate desires. This wasn't merely coincidence. It was the inevitable consequence of a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of human freedom itself. The progressive promise of liberation from traditional structures, family authority, moral standards, personal responsibility, social expectations, didn't produce autonomous individuals. Instead, it created different forms of bondage, often more complete and devastating than what supposedly preceded them. What I discovered contradicts everything our cultural elites believe about freedom. True liberty, I learned through countless clinical encounters, requires structure, boundaries, and what progressives dismiss as oppressive limitations. The paradox cuts to the heart of modern society's deepest illusions about human nature. Chapter 1: The Clinical Laboratory of False Freedom. My consulting room in the prison became an unwitting laboratory for observing how unlimited personal freedom transforms into the most restrictive form of slavery. Day after day, I encountered men who had pursued every impulse, rejected every social constraint, and exercised what progressives would call complete personal autonomy. Yet these supposedly free individuals were more thoroughly enslaved than any serf in medieval Europe. Consider the heroin addicts who insisted they were choosing their lifestyle. They spoke of freedom from conventional morality, liberation from bourgeois expectations, rejection of society's demands for productivity and conformity. Yet they were completely enslaved to their next fix, incapable of the most basic autonomous decisions. Their freedom from social constraints had become absolute bondage to chemical dependency. The pattern repeated itself across every category of patient. Young mothers who had been liberated from the expectation of marriage before childbearing found themselves enslaved to welfare systems, trapped in cycles of dependency they couldn't escape. Men freed from the oppression of steady employment became slaves to episodic violence and criminal thinking patterns that destroyed every relationship and opportunity. What struck me most profoundly was how these individuals had internalized the rhetoric of liberation while living in the most restrictive circumstances imaginable. They spoke of keeping it real and being authentic, while following behavioral scripts as rigid and predictable as any totalitarian regime might impose. Their rejection of external authority had simply transferred power to internal compulsions they were even less equipped to resist. The psychiatric ward revealed the same phenomenon. Patients who had been encouraged to express every emotion, follow every desire, and reject all social inhibitions often found themselves tyrannized by their own uncontrolled impulses. The therapeutic culture that promised liberation from repression had created individuals who couldn't function in any social context, prisoners of their own unrestricted psyches. This wasn't theoretical observation but daily clinical reality. The more completely someone embraced the ideology of unlimited personal freedom, the more thoroughly enslaved they became to forces beyond their conscious control. The paradox wasn't philosophical but empirical, observable, and tragically consistent. Chapter 2: The Cultural Architecture of Enslavement. The broader culture had created an elaborate architecture of false freedom that systematically produced the human wreckage I encountered daily. Popular music, television, educational curricula, and therapeutic interventions all promoted the same destructive message: authentic existence requires rejection of traditional restraints, moral standards, and social expectations. Young people absorbed this ideology through every cultural channel. Schools taught them that moral standards were oppressive social constructs rather than practical wisdom accumulated over centuries. Popular culture celebrated immediate gratification over delayed rewards, emotional expression over rational self-control, and individual desire over communal responsibility. The therapeutic establishment pathologized normal human limitations as psychological disorders requiring treatment rather than self-discipline. This cultural programming created individuals who were theoretically free to make any choice but practically incapable of making choices that served their long-term interests. They had been systematically deprived of the intellectual and moral tools necessary for genuine self-governance. Freedom without the capacity for wise choice becomes indistinguishable from slavery to impulse and circumstance. The most insidious aspect was how this false liberation was marketed as progressive enlightenment. Cultural elites congratulated themselves on freeing people from repressive, traditional structures while creating new forms of bondage more complete than anything that preceded them. The welfare state enslaved people to dependency. Progressive education enslaved them to ignorance disguised as sophistication. Therapeutic culture enslaved them to victimhood and excuse-making. What made this particularly tragic was observing how different cultures produced different outcomes. Patients from traditional immigrant families, despite facing similar economic circumstances, showed markedly different patterns of behavior and life outcomes. They maintained internal structures, respect for authority, delayed gratification, personal responsibility, family loyalty, that enabled genuine freedom of choice. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Those raised with clear boundaries, moral expectations, and social obligations demonstrated far greater capacity for autonomous decision-making than those raised with unlimited freedom to explore their authentic selves. Structure, rather than constraining freedom, appeared to be its prerequisite. The cultural architects of liberation had created a generation of people who couldn't distinguish between freedom and license, between authentic choice and impulsive reaction. They had systematically destroyed the social and psychological foundations that make meaningful freedom possible. Chapter 3: The Economics of Dependency. The welfare system provided perhaps the clearest demonstration of how progressive attempts to create freedom actually manufacture slavery. Patients frequently explained their life choices through the economic logic of dependency. Working offered little advantage over remaining unemployed. Marriage provided fewer benefits than single parenthood, and education seemed pointless when basic needs were guaranteed regardless of personal effort. This wasn't laziness or moral failing, it was rational response to perverse incentives. The system designed to provide temporary assistance had created permanent dependency by removing the natural consequences of personal choices. When survival is guaranteed regardless of behavior, the motivation for self-improvement disappears. When irresponsibility is subsidized, it inevitably increases. I observed 3 generations of families trapped in this system, each generation more thoroughly enslaved than the previous one. Grandmothers who had worked before becoming welfare recipients maintained some memory of independence and self-respect. Their daughters, raised partially within the system, struggled with the contradictions between dependency and autonomy. Their granddaughters, born into welfare dependency, often couldn't imagine any other way of living. The psychological effects were devastating. These individuals developed what I came to recognize as learned helplessness on a generational scale. They had been systematically taught that their choices didn't matter, that external circumstances determined their fate, and that personal agency was either impossible or pointless. The system designed to help them had destroyed their capacity for self-direction. Yet defenders of this system continue to speak about providing freedom from economic insecurity. They couldn't see, or refused to acknowledge, that security purchased through dependency wasn't freedom but its opposite. When basic needs are guaranteed regardless of personal effort, the result isn't liberation but a particularly insidious form of slavery that destroys both material prospects and psychological autonomy. The economic relationships reinforced broader cultural messages about personal responsibility. If society owed individuals a living regardless of their choices, why develop self-discipline, work habits, or long-term planning skills? If consequences were always cushioned by intervention, why learn from mistakes or modify destructive behaviors? This created what economists might call moral hazard on a societal scale, but the effects were far more profound than economic theory suggests. Removing the connection between choices and consequences doesn't just change incentives, it fundamentally alters human psychology and character development. It creates people who are structurally incapable of genuine freedom because they've never developed the internal resources necessary for autonomous decision-making. The tragedy was that this system was implemented with the best intentions, by people who genuinely believed they were increasing human freedom and dignity. They couldn't see that freedom requires not just the absence of external constraints but the presence of internal capacities that can only be developed through facing real consequences for one's choices. Chapter 4: The Sentimentalism That Enslaves. Perhaps no force proved more enslaving than the sentimentalism that masqueraded as compassion throughout the therapeutic and social services establishment. This false compassion consistently produced outcomes directly opposite to its stated intentions, creating deeper and more permanent forms of human bondage than the problems it claimed to address. Sentimentalism differs fundamentally from genuine compassion in its relationship to truth and consequences. True compassion seeks what actually helps people in the long term, even when that requires difficult honesty or temporary discomfort. Sentimentalism prioritizes the emotional satisfaction of the helper over the genuine welfare of the helped, avoiding unpleasant truths and natural consequences that might produce real improvement. I watched social workers, therapists, and bureaucrats consistently choose the sentimental response over the compassionate one. They would provide endless excuses for destructive behavior rather than confronting patients with the reality of their choices. They would extend deadlines, waive requirements, and remove consequences in the name of understanding and support. The result was predictable: behavior that wasn't confronted inevitably worsened. This therapeutic sentimentalism created a particularly insidious form of slavery because it disguised itself as care while systematically undermining the patient's capacity for genuine improvement. By treating people as victims of circumstances beyond their control rather than agents capable of better choices, it destroyed the psychological foundation necessary for real change. The language of therapy became a prison more effective than any physical constraint. Patients learn to speak of their issues, their triggers, their trauma responses, and their healing journey while remaining completely stuck in destructive patterns. The vocabulary of victimhood provided endless excuses for avoiding the difficult work of character development and behavioral change. Paradoxically, this supposedly compassionate approach showed profound disrespect for human dignity and potential. It assumed that certain categories of people couldn't be held to normal standards of behavior and responsibility. This assumption, however well-intentioned, effectively declared these individuals to be permanently inferior, incapable of the moral agency that defines human dignity. The sentimentalism extended beyond individual therapy into broader social policy. Criminal justice systems that prioritized rehabilitation over consequences, educational systems that eliminated standards to avoid stigmatizing failure, and family courts that refused to enforce parental responsibility all reflected the same fundamental error: confusing kindness with enabling, compassion with excuse-making. The cruelest irony was that this approach consistently produced more suffering than it prevented. Criminals who avoided consequences committed more crimes. Students who weren't held to standards remained ignorant. Parents who faced no enforcement of their obligations abandoned their responsibilities. The supposed beneficiaries of sentimental compassion became trapped in cycles of dysfunction that genuine consequences might have interrupted. What I learned through years of clinical observation was that real love sometimes requires saying no, setting boundaries, and allowing people to face the natural results of their choices. Sentimentalism that prevents this isn't compassion, it's a form of emotional self-indulgence that enslaves its supposed beneficiaries to perpetual dysfunction while allowing its practitioners to feel virtuous about their caring responses. Chapter 5: The Linguistic Prison of Progressive Orthodoxy. Language itself had become a tool of enslavement, creating conceptual prisons that made clear thinking about human problems nearly impossible. The corruption of language wasn't accidental but systematic, designed to prevent honest analysis of social phenomena and their causes. Consider how progressives had transformed the very vocabulary of human agency. Choice now applied only to approved decisions, reproductive choices, lifestyle choices, career choices, while disappearing entirely from discussions of behaviors progressives wanted to excuse. Criminal behavior became the result of root causes, addiction became a disease, and academic failure became a function of socio-economic factors. The language systematically obscured human responsibility while inflating the influence of external circumstances. This linguistic manipulation created cognitive imprisonment among both practitioners and patients. Social workers couldn't discuss personal responsibility because their professional vocabulary had eliminated the concepts necessary for such discussion. Patients couldn't recognize their own agency because the therapeutic language they'd learned defined them primarily as victims of forces beyond their control. The Orwellian dimension became clear in daily practice. Empowerment meant creating dependency on professional services. Healing meant endlessly discussing problems without addressing the behaviors that created them. Recovery meant managing symptoms rather than eliminating their causes. Support meant providing excuses for continued dysfunction. Each term had been inverted to mean its opposite while retaining its positive emotional associations. Educational institutions had become particularly effective generators of this corrupted language. Students learned to analyze everything through frameworks of oppression and victimization while losing the vocabulary necessary for discussing personal agency, moral standards, or individual responsibility. They could identify endless forms of systemic problems while remaining blind to the role of personal choices in creating life outcomes. The linguistic prison extended into popular culture, where complex social phenomena were reduced to simple narratives of victim and oppressor. This conceptual framework made nuanced analysis impossible while creating artificial emotional responses to social problems. People learned to feel rather than think about social issues, to respond with sentiment rather than reason. Medical practice revealed how thoroughly this linguistic corruption had penetrated professional discourse. Psychiatric diagnoses expanded to pathologize normal human limitations and character flaws. Behavioral problems became disorders requiring treatment rather than discipline. Moral failures became symptoms requiring therapy rather than choices requiring different decisions. The effect on public policy was catastrophic. When problems couldn't be named accurately, solutions became impossible. When human agency was systematically denied, interventions focused on everything except the actual causes of dysfunction. When personal responsibility was linguistically eliminated, policies inevitably produced more of the problems they claimed to address. Breaking free from this linguistic prison requires conscious effort to reclaim precise language for discussing human behavior and social phenomena. It means insisting that choices are choices, that consequences are consequences, and that personal responsibility is real regardless of circumstances. It means rejecting the emotional manipulation embedded in progressive vocabulary while maintaining genuine compassion for human suffering. The stakes couldn't be higher. Language shapes thought, thought shapes policy, and policy shapes lives. When language is corrupted, everything downstream becomes corrupted as well. Restoring honest discourse isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's a prerequisite for creating policies that actually help rather than harm the people they're supposed to serve. Chapter 6: the relativism that enslaves. Moral relativism, supposedly the ultimate expression of intellectual freedom, had become one of the most effective tools for creating psychological and social slavery. By declaring all moral standards arbitrary cultural constructs, relativism didn't liberate people from oppressive restrictions, it removed the ethical frameworks necessary for navigating complex social relationships and personal decisions. The psychological effects were immediately observable in clinical practice. Patients raised in relativistic environments often displayed profound moral confusion that manifested as anxiety, depression, and inability to make coherent life choices. Without stable ethical frameworks, they couldn't evaluate potential actions or predict their consequences. They lived in constant uncertainty about right and wrong, resulting in paralysis or impulsive decision-making that consistently produced negative outcomes. This moral confusion created particular vulnerability to manipulation by anyone willing to provide definitive answers. Patients without internal ethical compasses frequently fell under the influence of criminals, cults, or ideological movements that offered certainty in exchange for complete submission. Their freedom from traditional moral constraints made them easy targets for new forms of intellectual and behavioral control. The relativistic approach to child-rearing produced especially tragic results. Children need clear moral boundaries to develop healthy psychological structures and social relationships. When parents refuse to impose moral standards, believing this would allow children to develop their own authentic values, the children typically developed no coherent values at all. They reached adulthood emotionally and ethically unprepared for adult responsibilities. Paradoxically, moral relativism consistently produced its own rigid orthodoxies. While claiming that all viewpoints were equally valid, relativistic institutions aggressively suppressed certain perspectives while privileging others. Universities that celebrated diversity of opinion routinely punished faculty and students who challenged progressive assumptions. Therapeutic practices that supposedly honored all lifestyle choices consistently pathologized traditional moral commitments. The selective application of relativism revealed its true function, not to increase intellectual freedom but to undermine specific moral traditions while establishing new forms of ideological control. Relativism applied only to traditional standards of behavior, while progressive political positions were treated as moral absolutes beyond question or criticism. This created a particularly insidious form of intellectual slavery. People were taught to doubt their own moral intuitions while accepting without question the ethical pronouncements of progressive authorities. They learned to feel guilty about making moral judgments while congratulating themselves on their tolerance and sophistication. The result was moral paralysis disguised as enlightenment. Clinical observation revealed that humans have deep psychological needs for moral structure and meaning. Attempts to eliminate these needs through relativistic education typically produced not freedom but different forms of compulsive behavior. Patients without coherent moral frameworks often developed elaborate psychological symptoms, addictive behaviors, or political obsessions that functioned as substitute moral systems. The most devastating effect was on family relationships and community structures. Moral relativism made it impossible to maintain the shared standards necessary for stable social institutions. When everything was considered equally valid, nothing was considered important enough to defend or preserve. Communities disintegrated not because of external pressure but because of internal moral confusion. Yet recovering moral clarity required more than simply rejecting relativism. It demanded the intellectual courage to make distinctions between better and worse, right and wrong, beneficial and harmful. It required accepting that some ways of living produce better outcomes than others, and that these differences reflect objective realities rather than mere cultural preferences. The clinical evidence was overwhelming. People with clear moral frameworks, regardless of their specific content, demonstrated greater psychological resilience, better social relationships, and more effective decision-making than those trapped in relativistic confusion. Moral standards, far from constraining human flourishing, appeared to be prerequisites for it. Chapter 7: The Path to Genuine Liberation. Recovery from the false freedom that enslaves requires understanding what genuine liberty actually entails and developing the internal resources necessary to achieve it. This isn't a theoretical exercise but a practical program based on observing what actually helps people escape cycles of dysfunction and dependency. True freedom begins with accepting responsibility for one's choices and their consequences. This sounds simple but proves revolutionary for people raised in therapeutic cultures that systematically obscure the connection between decisions and outcomes. The first step toward liberation is recognizing that current circumstances largely result from past choices, and that different choices can produce different results. This recognition often produces initial discomfort because it eliminates the psychological comfort of victimhood. Blaming external circumstances for personal problems provides temporary emotional relief while ensuring permanent powerlessness. Accepting responsibility removes the comfort while restoring the possibility of effective action. Most people prefer comfortable slavery to uncomfortable freedom. Developing genuine autonomy requires rebuilding the internal structures that progressive culture systematically destroys. This means cultivating delayed gratification rather than immediate satisfaction, rational analysis rather than emotional reaction, and principled decision-making rather than impulse following. These aren't natural traits but learned skills that must be consciously developed through practice and repetition. The process requires what I came to think of as moral courage, the willingness to act according to principles rather than feelings, to maintain standards despite social pressure, and to accept unpopular truths rather than comfortable illusions. This courage can't be taught through therapy or education but must be developed through facing real challenges and consequences. Family relationships provide crucial training ground for developing genuine autonomy. Children need parents who set clear boundaries, enforce consistent consequences, and model responsible behavior. Adults need to practice these same principles in their own relationships, rejecting the therapeutic tendency to excuse destructive behavior in the name of understanding or acceptance. Economic independence represents another essential component of genuine freedom. This requires developing work habits, practical skills, and financial discipline rather than relying on government assistance or family support. The temporary discomfort of economic uncertainty often proves necessary for developing the capabilities that enable long-term prosperity and autonomy. Intellectual honesty becomes crucial for escaping ideological slavery. This means questioning popular assumptions, examining evidence rather than accepting convenient narratives, and maintaining skepticism toward anyone claiming to offer simple solutions to complex problems. It requires the humility to admit ignorance while maintaining confidence in the possibility of discovering truth through careful observation and reasoning. Community relationships provide both accountability and support for maintaining personal standards. Healthy communities enforce social expectations while providing assistance during difficult periods. This differs fundamentally from the enabling that characterizes dysfunctional social relationships, which provide support without expectations and assistance without accountability. The spiritual dimension can't be ignored, though it needn't involve traditional religious commitment. People need sources of meaning larger than immediate personal satisfaction, frameworks for understanding suffering and purpose, and practices that connect them with transcendent values. Without these elements, even material success often feels empty and purposeless. What emerges from this process isn't the elimination of all constraints but the development of internal constraints that serve genuine human flourishing. These self-imposed limitations, moral standards, rational habits, disciplined behaviors, create space for authentic choice rather than mere reaction to impulse and circumstance. The irony is profound. Accepting certain limitations enables genuine freedom, while rejecting all limitations ensures slavery to forces beyond conscious control. This isn't paradox but practical wisdom that countless generations discovered through experience and that progressive ideology has temporarily obscured. Conclusion. The paradox I discovered through decades of clinical observation reveals a fundamental truth about human nature that our culture desperately needs to recover. Genuine freedom requires structure, limitation, and the acceptance of responsibility. The progressive promise of liberation from traditional constraints has produced not autonomous individuals but different forms of bondage more complete and devastating than what they replaced. This isn't merely academic observation but urgent practical knowledge. Every day, more people become enslaved to dependency, addiction, victimhood, and moral confusion while believing themselves to be exercising unprecedented freedom. The human cost grows exponentially as these patterns spread through families, communities, and institutions. Recovery requires the courage to reject comfortable illusions in favor of uncomfortable truths. It demands rebuilding the internal and social structures that enable genuine choice rather than mere impulse. It necessitates accepting that some ways of living produce better outcomes than others, and that these differences reflect objective realities rather than cultural preferences. The stakes couldn't be higher. A civilization that confuses freedom with license, liberation with dependency, and autonomy with moral relativism cannot long survive. But the solution remains within reach for anyone willing to choose the difficult path of genuine responsibility over the easy path of comfortable slavery. The choice, as always, is ours to make. That choice itself represents the ultimate freedom, and the ultimate test of our commitment to human dignity and flourishing.